You're a prince.
Elara, please.
You let me believe you were like me. You were playing at being real. It was part of your game.
It was never a game. Everything I felt, everything we shared, that was the truest thing in my entire life.
But even as he spoke the words, he could see them failing to bridge the chasm that had opened between them. A chasm measured not in distance, but in broken trust. And he understood with devastating clarity that love built on lies, no matter how well-intentioned, must face the fire of truth before it can become real. How did a prince and a village woman come to this moment of shattering? How did love bloom in such unlikely soil, only to be threatened by the very secrets that brought them together? And can any love survive when the foundation upon which it was built turns out to be made of sand? This is their story, told by moonlight, as our ancestors taught us to tell it, with all the joy and pain and truth that makes us human. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe as you enjoy the rest of the story.
Prince Alexander stood at the highest tower of the Valdorian palace, gazing down at the sprawling kingdom that stretched endlessly beneath the morning mist. From this height, the villages looked like scattered seeds on fertile ground, the rivers like silver threads woven through green cloth, and the people like ants moving with purpose he could never understand. He was 28 years old, ruler of the wealthiest nation in the Southern Territories, possessor of mines filled with diamonds and gold, owner of fleets that sailed every sea, and yet, as he stood there in his silk robes embroidered with threads of pure gold, he felt emptier than the vast sky above him. Every person who approached him did so with calculated smiles, measured words, and eyes that saw not Alexander the man, but Alexander the crown, Alexander the fortune, Alexander the key to their own advancement. His childhood friend had betrayed him for a trade agreement. His betrothed had confessed she loved only his title, and his own council members whispered behind jeweled fans about how to manipulate his decrees for their benefit. He had everything the world believed a man could want, yet he possessed nothing that made him feel truly alive. That night, as the full moon cast silver shadows across his bedchamber, Alexander made a decision that would have sent his advisors into fits of panic had they known. He summoned his most trusted servant, old Matthias, who had served his father and grandfather before him, and revealed a plan that had been forming in his mind like a seed pushing through stone. "I will leave this palace," Alexander declared, his voice steady despite the wildness of his words. "I will go to the most distant village in our kingdom, a place where no one knows my face, and I will live as a common man, as a servant if I must, until I discover what it means to be valued for who I am rather than what I possess." Matthias, whose weathered face had seen 3 generations of royalty, did not immediately protest as others would have done. Instead, he studied the prince with eyes that had grown wise through decades of silent observation, and then slowly nodded. "Your Highness," he said quietly, "your grandfather once told me that a man who has never known hunger cannot truly appreciate bread, and a prince who has never known obscurity cannot truly understand his people. Go, but take this ring." He pressed a simple bronze band into Alexander's palm. "And when you are ready to return, send it to me, and I shall come for you." And so, as the palace slept and the guards changed their watch, Prince Alexander slipped through a servant's entrance, dressed in plain wool and rough cotton, carrying nothing but his small sack of modest coins, his grandfather's ring, and a heart desperate for something real.
The journey to Millbrook took Alexander 5 days on foot, and each day stripped away another layer of the prince he had been. On the first day, his feet, accustomed only to the softest leather boots and polished marble floors, blistered and bled inside the crude shoes Matthias had provided, and he learned that pain was a relentless teacher that demanded acknowledgement. He walked through forests where merchants traveled in guarded caravans, Past farms where families walked from dawn until dusk in fields that would yield barely enough to see them through winter, and through small settlements where children played with sticks and stones, finding joy in what his treasury would have deemed worthless. On the second night, he slept beneath a baobab tree, its ancient branches stretching toward the stars like the garnered fingers of time itself. And he was awakened by a family of travelers who shared their meager meal of millet porridge and dried fish with him, asking nothing in return except his company and his stories. He invented a history for himself, a wanderer seeking work, a man without family, someone who had lost everything to misfortune. And as he spoke these lies, he felt a strange kind of truth in them, for what was he really but a man who had lost touch with everything that mattered? By the time Alexander reached the borders of Millbrook on the 5th day, he was no longer the polished prince who had left the palace. The sun had darkened his skin to bronze, dust had settled into every crease of his clothing, and hunger had taught his stomach to be grateful rather than particular. Millbrook itself was smaller than he had imagined, a collection of perhaps 200 souls living in mud brick homes with thatched roofs, gathered around a central market square where farmers sold vegetables, craftsmen displayed their wares, and children chased chickens between the stalls. The village was nestled in a valley between two hills, with a river running along its eastern edge that provided water for crops and washing, and the whole place had an air of honest simplicity that made Alexander's heart ache with something he couldn't quite name. As he walked down the main road, he noticed people watching him with curiosity but not suspicion, nodding greetings as though strangers were simply friends they hadn't yet met, and an old woman selling clay pots called out to him, "You look hungry, young man. The inn serves a good supper if you have coin, and if you don't, tell Mama Adisa that Grandmother Kendi said to feed you first and worry about payment later." He thanked her with genuine warmth, his royal training in diplomacy serving him well even in this humble context, and made his way toward the building she had pointed out, a 2-story structure of wood and stone with a sign hanging above the door that read, "The Harvest Moon Inn," in painted letters that had faded from many seasons of sun and rain.
The interior of the Harvest Moon Inn was warm and fragrant with the scent of cooking spices, wood smoke, and fresh bread that made Alexander's stomach clench with genuine hunger for the first time in his privileged life. The main room was filled with rough-hewn tables and benches where villagers sat sharing meals and stories, their laughter rising and falling like music. And in the corner, a man played a talking drum that spoke in the old language of their ancestors, telling tales without words. Behind a long wooden counter stood a woman of middle years with kind eyes and graying hair wrapped in a colorful headscarf. And when she saw Alexander, she gestured him forward with a flourish of her flour-dusted hands. "Welcome, traveler," she said in a voice that carried the warmth of a mother and the authority of a queen in her own domain. "I am Adisa, keeper of this establishment. Grandmother Kemi sent word ahead through Young Coffee. Messages travel faster than feet in Millbrook, and any friend of hers is welcome here. You look like a man who has walked far and eaten little. Sit, and I will bring you something to restore your strength." Alexander began to reach for his small purse of coins, but Adisa waved him off with a decisive shake of her head. "First you eat, then we talk of payment. In Millbrook, we do not let strangers go hungry while we negotiate." It was as Alexander sat at a corner table, grateful beyond measure, that he first saw her. Elara emerged from the kitchen carrying a large wooden tray laden with steaming bowls of groundnut soup, plates of jollof rice studded with vegetables, and pieces of grilled fish that had been caught from the river that very morning. She moved through the crowded room with an easy grace, her lean frame speaking of years of hard work, her movements efficient but never rushed. And when she smiled at the patrons, it was with genuine warmth that reached all the way to her eyes, eyes the color of honey in sunlight, bright with intelligence, and something Alexander would later recognize as an unguarded spirit. She wore a simple wrapper of indigo cloth and a white blouse that had been mended in several places with careful stitches, and her hair was gathered in small braids that were woven with colored thread in patterns he didn't recognize, but found beautiful in their intricacy. When she reached his table, she set down a bowl of soup and a plate piled generously with food, and their eyes met for a brief moment that seemed to stretch longer than it should have. "You must be the traveler Grandmother Kemi sent," she said, and her voice was like cool water, clear and refreshing. "I am Elara, Mama Adisa's daughter. Eat well, and when you're finished, if you are looking for work, we could use an extra pair of hands around here. Our last helper left to get married in the next village, and we've been managing alone, but barely." Alexander found himself nodding before he could think, captivated not by her beauty, though she was lovely in an uncontrived way, but by the directness of her gaze, the absence of artifice in her expression, the sense that she was seeing him, truly seeing him, not as a prince or a title or a source of advantage, but simply as a man who might need work and might be willing to earn his keep.
Alexander's first week at the Harvest Moon Inn stripped away any romantic notions he might have harbored about the simplicity of common life. He woke each morning before dawn when Elara knocked on the door of the small storage room that had been converted into his sleeping quarters, and stumbled into the pre-dawn darkness to help her draw water from the well, his soft hands blistering around the rope and his back screaming in protest at the repetitive motion. He learned to split firewood for the cooking hearth, and the first time he swung the axe, he missed the log entirely and nearly took off his own foot, causing Elara to laugh, not mockingly, but with genuine mirth as she showed him the proper stance and swing, her hands briefly guiding his in a way that made his heart beat faster for reasons that had nothing to do with exertion. He scrubbed floors until his knees were raw, washed dishes until his fingers wrinkled like dried fruit, hauled sacks of grain that seemed determined to burst and spill their contents at the most inconvenient moments, and served meals to villagers who treated him with friendly indifference, seeing in him exactly what he appeared to be, a wanderer who had found work and was doing his best to earn his place. Every muscle in his body discovered new ways to ache. Every blister on his hands taught him the price of labor, and every night he collapsed onto his simple straw mattress with exhaustion so complete that he barely remembered his own name, let alone his title. Yet, despite the physical hardship, or perhaps because of it, Alexander found himself experiencing moments of pure joy that had eluded him in all his years of luxury. When old Papa Kwame, a farmer with only 3 teeth and a laugh like thunder, declared that Alexander made the worst tea in the entire history of Millbrook, but clapped him on the shoulder with genuine affection, Alexander felt more valued than when his counsel had praised his policy decisions with calculated flattery. When little Amara, a child of perhaps 6 years who often came to the inn with her parents, asked him to tell her a story while she waited for her meal, and then fell asleep with her arm on his arm, trusting him completely in the way only children can, he experienced a tenderness he had never known. And when Elara worked beside him in the kitchen, teaching him to knead bread dough with the heels of his hands, to season soup by taste rather than measurement, to judge when the fish was perfectly grilled by the sound it made on the fire, their conversations flowed as easily as the river beyond the village, touching on everything from the behavior of the stars to the nature of happiness to whether the spotted hen in the yard was plotting something devious. In these moments, Alexander forgot he was a prince. He simply became a man learning to live, and in that learning, he discovered a version of himself he had never known existed, someone capable, growing, real, and increasingly captivated by the woman who moved through her hard life with such grace and quiet strength.
As the weeks turned into months, the bond between Alexander and Elara deepened like roots, growing slowly but surely into fertile soil. They developed rhythms of work and conversation that felt as natural as breathing, rising together in the pearl-gray light of dawn to prepare the inn for the day, moving around each other in the kitchen with an awareness that needed no words, sharing the burden of difficult tasks and the small triumphs of successful meals and satisfied customers. Elara began to teach him about the village and its people, pointing out the relationships and histories that wove the community together like threads in a tapestry. How blacksmith Ade had once saved Farmer Chioma's daughter from drowning, and now they were bound by a debt deeper than family. How the rivalry between the two basket weavers was actually rooted in a love triangle from 30 years ago that everyone found amusing except the basket weavers themselves. How the village came together every harvest season to help those whose crops had failed,
ensuring no one went hungry, even if it meant everyone had a little less. Through her eyes, Alexander began to understand that wealth wasn't measured only in gold and land, but in the strength of connections, the reliability of neighbors, and the knowledge that you are part of something larger than yourself. One evening, after the last customers had left and Mama Adisa had retired to her room, Alexander and Elara sat together on the inn's back steps, watching the moon rise over the river while the night birds called to each other in the darkness. "Tell me, Alexander," Elara said, using the name he had given her, which happened to be his true name, though she didn't know its full significance. "What made you leave your old life and come to Millbrook? You never speak of your past, and I don't mean to pry, but sometimes when you think no one is watching, you get this look in your eyes, like you're remembering a place you can't return to." Alexander felt the weight of his deception like a stone in his chest, but he answered as truthfully as he could without revealing his identity. "I lived a life where people wanted things from me, not me myself," he said quietly. "Every word spoken to me was calculated. Every smile had a price. Every friendship was a transaction. I came here seeking something authentic, something real, and I found it." Elara was silent for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried a vulnerability he had rarely heard from her. "I understand more than you might think. After my father died 5 years ago, men from neighboring villages came seeking to marry me, but Mama Adisa saw through them. They wanted the inn, the business, the security. They didn't see me, they saw an opportunity. I chose to remain alone rather than be valued for what I could provide instead of who I am." Their hands found each other in the darkness, fingers intertwining with a rightness that felt like destiny, and in that moment, Alexander knew with absolute certainty that he was falling in love with this woman whose inner wealth far exceeded all the treasures in his palace vaults, even as the secret of his identity loomed between them like a shadow he didn't yet know how to dispel.
The announcement that the annual Harvest Festival would take place in 3 weeks' time sent Millbrook into a flurry of joyful preparation that reminded Alexander of how his palace prepared for state occasions. Except here, the excitement was genuine rather than obligatory. Every family contributed something. The farmers brought the finest of their produce. The craft people created decorations and prizes for contests. The hunters promised to provide meat for the great feast, and the musicians began practicing songs that would make the very earth seem to dance. Elara and Mama Adisa volunteered the Harvest Moon Inn as one of the food preparation centers, which meant Alexander found himself working from dawn until well past dusk, learning to prepare traditional dishes he had only ever eaten in his palace dining room, served on golden plates by silent servants. Now he ground peppers and tomatoes on stone slabs until his arms trembled with fatigue, stirred massive pots of bubbling stew that could feed 50 people, and shaped hundreds of small dough balls that would be fried into the sweet treats children dreamed about for months after the festival ended. Elara worked beside him throughout it all, and he noticed how the entire village seemed to light up in her presence. She remembered every child's name and favorite sweet, knew exactly how to comfort widow Neka when she grew sad remembering her late husband, who had loved the festival, and could mediate disputes between vendors with a wisdom that would have served any royal court. On the night of the festival, Millbrook transformed into a place of magic and firelight, with torches blazing along every path, and the central square decorated with woven palm fronds and flowers that filled the air with perfume. Long tables groaned under the weight of food, musicians played with wild abandon on drums and flutes, and the talking drum that seemed to carry the heartbeat of the ancestors themselves. And people danced with an unself-conscious joy that made Alexander's formal court dances seem like funeral marches in comparison. When Elara emerged from the inn wearing a special wrapper of deep blue cloth patterned with golden stars and her braids adorned with small bells that chimed softly with her movements, Alexander felt his breath catch in his throat, and he understood for the first time what his poets had meant when they wrote of beauty that pierced the soul. She took his hand without hesitation and pulled him into the dancing circle, teaching him the steps as they moved, laughing when he stumbled but never mocking, her body warm and alive beside his as they spun under the stars.
In that moment, as the entire village danced as one, and the drums spoke their ancient language, and Elara's eyes reflected the firelight like captured stars, Alexander experienced a happiness so complete, so pure, that he knew his old life of gilded isolation had been nothing but an elaborate form of death. He pulled her closer as the music swelled, and when she rested her head briefly against his shoulder, he felt the walls around his heart, walls he had built to protect himself from disappointment and betrayal, finally crumble into dust, leaving him exposed and vulnerable, and more alive than he had ever been.
The morning after the festival, as Millbrook slowly recovered from its celebration, and Alexander helped Elara clean the inn, while Mama Adisa visited with friends, a merchant caravan arrived in the village square, their wagons laden with goods from distant cities, and their guards bearing weapons that gleamed expensively in the sunlight. Such caravans occasionally passed through Millbrook on their way to larger trading centers, and normally they would stay only long enough to water their horses and purchase fresh provisions. But this caravan lingered, and Alexander noticed the merchant captain, a shrewd-eyed man named Okafor, whom he recognized from palace trade negotiations, watching him with an expression that moved from confusion to shock to calculated assessment. Alexander's blood ran cold as he realized his carefully constructed anonymity was about to shatter. Okafor knew his face, had negotiated directly with him in the palace throne room, and even though Alexander's appearance had changed significantly, his skin darkened by sun, his body hardened by labor, his clothes rough and common, recognition was dawning in the merchant's eyes. That afternoon, as Alexander drew water from the well, Okafor approached with 2 of his guards, and Alexander knew the moment of reckoning had arrived. "Your Highness," Okafor said in a voice pitched low enough that others couldn't hear, and the title hung in the air between them like a blade. "The entire kingdom has been searching for you. Your council believes you were kidnapped or murdered. They have offered a reward of 10,000 gold pieces for information leading to your recovery." Alexander's mind raced through possibilities and consequences, seeing his peaceful existence in Millbrook evaporating in morning mist. But he met Okafor's case steadily and spoke with the authority of his royal training. "Merchant Okafor, I am not kidnapped and I am not in danger. I am here by my own choice, and I ask you to respect my wishes and say nothing of what you have seen. I will return to the palace when I am ready, and not before." Okafor studied him for a long moment, and Alexander could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. The reward money weighed against potential future favors from a prince who remembered loyalty. The sensationalism of revealing a royal secret weighed against the risk of angering that same prince. Finally, Okafor bowed slightly. "I will give you 2 weeks, Your Highness," he said quietly. "I have business that will keep me in the northern territories for that time. But when I return to the capital, I cannot in good conscience keep such important information from your council, not when the entire kingdom grieves your absence, and neighboring nations eye our borders with greedy intent, sensing weakness. 2 weeks to resolve whatever you are doing here, and then I must do my duty as a subject of Valdoria." With that, he returned to his caravan, and Alexander stood by the well with his bucket of water, feeling the walls of his 2 worlds closing in on him, knowing that his time in paradise was now counted in days, and he still had not found the courage to tell Elara the truth.
The knowledge that his time was limited changed everything for Alexander. Each moment with Elara became precious and painful at once, like holding something beautiful that he knew he would soon have to surrender. He tried several times to tell her the truth, once while they prepared bread in the pre-dawn kitchen, once while they sat by the river during a rare moment of rest, once while they walked together in the inn's garden, pulling weeds from between the vegetable plants. But each time the words stuck in his throat like thorns, and he found himself unable to speak them. How could he explain that he had built their entire relationship on a foundation of deception? How could he make her understand that his feelings were real even though his identity had been false? He knew that noble love stories often involved disguised princes and common maidens, but those were tales told by firelight, not the messy reality of 2 people who had built something genuine that was now threatened by the truth. The secret ate at him like acid, corroding his joy, making every touch of Elara's hand a reminder of his dishonesty, turning his happiness bitter with the knowledge of the pain he would soon cause. Elara noticed the change in him, of course. She was too perceptive not to see the shadow that had fallen across his spirit. "You've been troubled since that merchant caravan came through," she said one evening as they sat together after closing the inn, her hand finding his in the darkness. "Did something happen? Did someone from your past find you?"
Alexander felt the moment stretching out, felt the opportunity to confess hanging before him like an open door. But fear held his tongue. Fear of losing her, fear of seeing love turn to anger in her eyes, fear of proving that he was just another person who had deceived her for his own purposes, no different from those suitors who had wanted her for the inn rather than herself. Nothing happened, he lied, and the words tasted like poison. I've just been thinking about the future, about what comes next. Elara was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried a gentle vulnerability that made his heart ache. Alexander, I need to tell you something, and I'm not sure how you'll receive it, but I can't keep it inside any longer. These months with you have been the happiest of my life. You work hard, you're kind to everyone, you treat me like an equal rather than a servant or a prize, and I found myself falling in love with you in a way I never thought possible. She turned to face him fully, her honey-colored eyes searching his in the moonlight. I know we are both poor, that we have nothing to offer each other except ourselves, but sometimes I dream about a future where we could build something together, maybe even run this inn as partners after Mama Adisa grows too old for the work. Tell me I'm not foolish for hoping. Alexander felt his heart breaking and soaring simultaneously, knowing that she loved him, but that his deception would poison that love when it was revealed. And he did the only thing he could do in that moment. He pulled her close and kissed her with all the desperate love and terrible regret that filled his soul, storing up the sweetness of this moment against the bitter days he knew were coming.
The confrontation came not from Merchant Okafor's return as Alexander had expected, but from an unexpected source. On the 13th day after his conversation with the merchant, as Alexander was chopping vegetables in the kitchen while Elara tended to customers in the main room, 3 riders on magnificent horses arrived at the inn wearing the royal colors of Valdoria, deep purple and gold, and bearing the royal seal. At their head was Matthias, his old servant, looking simultaneously relieved and worried, and Alexander knew immediately that Okafor must have sent word to the capital despite his promise to wait. The inn fell silent as the riders entered, and Alexander heard Matthias's voice carrying clearly from the main room. We seek Prince Alexander of Valdoria, heir to the throne and beloved son of our kingdom, who has been missing these past 4 months. We have reliable information that he has been seen in this village. The words hit Alexander like a physical blow, and through the kitchen doorway he could see Elara's face going pale with shock, her eyes searching the room and landing on him with a dawning realization that was terrible to witness. Everything happened too quickly after that. Matthias entered the kitchen and bowed low, the gesture revealing Alexander's identity to everyone present more effectively than words could have done, and customers who had laughed and joked with him for months now stared with open mouths and wide eyes, backing away as though he had suddenly become a stranger. But Alexander had eyes only for Elara, who stood frozen with a tray still in her hands, her expressions cycling through disbelief, comprehension, betrayal, and finally a hurt so deep it seemed to age her before his eyes. "Elara," he began, moving toward her, but she stepped back, and the tray slipped from her hands, shattering on the floor in a crash that sounded like the breaking of everything they have built together. "You're a prince," she said, and her voice was hollow, empty of the warmth it had always carried. "All this time, you've been playing at being poor, playing at being a servant, and I was part of your game." He tried to protest, tried to explain, but Mama Adisa had appeared and was looking at him with disappointment that cut deeper than anger would have, and the villagers who had welcomed him and worked beside him and accepted him were now murmuring with confusion and what might have been betrayal. "I never lied about what mattered," Alexander said desperately, his royal composure crumbling. "My feelings for you, everything I said, everything we shared, that was real, Elara. The only thing false was my name and my circumstances." But Elara shook her head, tears now streaming down her face. "How can I believe anything you've said when your entire presence here was built on deception? I told you about the men who wanted me for the inn rather than myself, and all along you were doing something worse. You wanted me as an experiment, a test, a way to feel authentic while you played pretend at poverty." Her voice broke on the last word, and she turned and fled through the back door, leaving Alexander standing in the wreckage of the life he had built, surrounded by people who no longer knew how to look at him.
Matthias brought news that made Alexander's personal crisis seem suddenly smaller. In his absence, neighboring kingdoms had begun testing Valdoria's borders, sensing weakness without visible leadership, and his council, well-meaning but panicked, had made decisions that were pushing the nation toward war. "Your Highness," Matthias said quietly that night, as Alexander sat in the small storage room that had been his home. "Your responsibilities call you back. The kingdom needs you." Alexander wanted to refuse, wanted to stay and find a way to make Elara understand. But he was raised as a prince, trained from birth to put duty before personal desire, and he could not ignore the needs of thousands of people for the sake of his own heart. The next morning, he prepared to leave, but before he mounted the horse Matthias had brought for him, he sought out Elara one final time. He found her at the river where they had spent so many peaceful moments, and she didn't run when he approached, though she didn't look at him either. "I am leaving," he said simply. "Not because I want to, but because my kingdom needs me, and I cannot abandon my responsibilities, even for love. But before I go, I need you to understand something. What I found here, what I found with you, was the first real thing in my entire life. Yes, I came here under false pretenses, and yes, I should have told you the truth sooner, and I will spend the rest of my life regretting that deception. But the man who fell in love with you, the man who learned to split firewood and make terrible tea and find joy in simple work, that was the truest version of myself I have ever been." Elara finally turned to look at him, her eyes red from crying, but clear with the intelligence and strength he had always admired. "Do you know what hurts most?" she asked. "It's not even the lying, though that cuts deep enough. It's that you'll go back to your palace and your golden plates and your silk robes, and eventually this will become a story you tell at fancy dinners, the time the prince lived as a peasant and had a charming romance with a simple innkeeper's daughter. I will be reduced to an anecdote, a chapter in your life, while you were my entire world." Alexander felt tears on his own face now, not caring that princes weren't supposed to weep. "Then come with me," he said with sudden desperate hope. "Come back to the palace, not as some conquest or trophy, but as my equal, my partner. Help me rule with the wisdom and compassion you've shown in running the inn and caring for this village. Teach me to remember what I learned here, to govern with the same values that make Millbrook strong. I love you, Elara, and I don't want to go back to that golden cage without you." For a long moment she studied him, and he could see her mind working through the implications, the complications, the vast gulf between their worlds. Then, slowly, she shook her head, and his heart broke completely. "I can't, Alexander. Maybe someday, when I've had time to think, and you've had time to prove that you're the man you say you are and not the prince who deceived me, maybe then we could find a way. But right now, I can't trust you, and without trust, what do we have?" She stood and walked past him, pausing only to add, "Go save your kingdom, your highness. If our love is real, it will survive the distance and the time, and if it's not, then at least we'll both know before I give up everything I am to enter your world." Alexander returned to the palace with a heavy heart, but he carried Millbrook with him in ways that changed everything. He reformed trade policies to protect small villages from exploitation by wealthy merchants, established laws ensuring fair treatment of servants and workers, and began visiting his kingdom in disguise regularly, listening to his people's real concerns rather than the filtered versions his court presented. He wore the bronze ring Matthias had given him on a chain around his neck, never forgetting the lesson of humility he had learned, and in his private chambers he kept the rough clothes he had worn in Millbrook, refusing to let himself forget who he had been when he was most himself. Months passed, then a year, and though he received reports that Elara was well and that the Harvest Moon Inn prospered, he honored her request for distance, proving through actions rather than words that he was worthy of her trust. Then, on the 2nd anniversary of the day he had first arrived in Millbrook, a message came from Mama Adisa, written in Elara's careful hand. "My daughter says to tell you that the inn could use a servant who knows how to make terrible tea if such a prince is willing to visit on occasion and remember how to be a man. And she says that perhaps love that can bridge the distance between a palace and a village is strong enough to build a life upon, though she would need to see for herself whether the prince she knew still lives inside the king you've become." Alexander didn't wait for his counselor's approval, or protocol, or proper royal procedure. He rode out that very day with only Matthias as companion, his heart lighter than it had been since he had left Millbrook. When he arrived at the inn and saw Elara standing in the doorway, older now and even more beautiful for the strength that time had added to her spirit, he dismounted and walked to her not as a prince approaching a subject, but as a man approaching the woman he loved. And when she smiled, tentatively at first, but then with the genuine warmth he had thought lost forever,
He knew they would find a way to make two worlds into one, building something real that would honor both the crown on his head and the love in his heart that had been born in the most unexpected place of all. And so the tale is told, under the light of the moon, that true love knows no boundaries between wealth and poverty, between palace and village, between crown and common cloth. For the greatest treasure a person can possess is not gold or jewels or power, but the genuine connection of two hearts that see each other truly, value each other honestly, and choose each other freely. And when such love is tested by time and distance, and the revelation of secrets, it either shatters like pottery on stone, or it emerges stronger, forged in the fires of truth, into something that can withstand any storm. This is the wisdom our ancestors knew, and this is why we tell tales by moonlight, so that each generation might remember that the measure of a person's worth lies not in what they possess, but in who they are when all masks are removed, and only their true self remains.